Hawaii sells itself as paradise. White sand, turquoise water, flowers in your hair, you know the pitch. And most of it is real. But what the brochures conveniently leave out is that some of the most fascinating parts of these islands are completely off limits to you. Permanently closed, restricted, guarded, or just quietly removed from any map you're ever going to find. And the reasons behind those restrictions? They're a lot more interesting than private property. From a privately owned island where outsiders have been banned for over 150 years, to a former military bombing range that still hasn't been fully cleared of explosives, to a leprosy settlement where the last surviving residents still choose to stay, Hawaii has a side that most visitors never get to see. These are the 9 restricted places in Hawaii you're not meant to find. Place 9. Niihau, the Forbidden Island. Let's start with the most famous one. Niihau sits just 17 miles southwest of Kauai, close enough that on a clear day you can see it from the shore. And yet, almost no one has set foot on it. The island was purchased in 1864 by a Scottish widow named Elizabeth Sinclair, who bought it from King Kamehameha V for $10,000 in gold. When the deal was made, the king reportedly asked the family to preserve the island and protect its people. They took that request seriously, more seriously than perhaps anyone expected. The Robinson family, Sinclair's descendants, have owned Niihau ever since. And for well over a century, they've enforced a strict no visitors policy. No hotels, no ferries, no tours, no roads connecting it to the outside world. The only village, Pu'uai, is off limits to outsiders entirely. What's left on Niihau is something increasingly rare. A community of native Hawaiians, where Hawaiian is still the primary spoken language. One of the very last places on Earth where that's true. As of the 2020 census, the population had fallen to 84 people. No Wi-Fi, no running water, no cars. Residents get around on horseback and bicycles. The Niihau school serves children through 8th grade and runs entirely on solar panels. The Robinson brothers, Keith and Bruce, have resisted enormous pressure from Hawaiian politicians who want the island open to the public. So far, they've held the line. The only way most people will ever experience Niihau is from the air. A helicopter tour that lands on a remote beach for a few hours, then leaves. Outsiders are not permitted to spend the night. You don't get to see the village, you don't get to meet the residents, you get the beach, and then you go home. Keith Robinson, one of the island's co-owners, has said that Niihau's secluded shoreline gives the endangered Hawaiian monk seal a safe haven found nowhere else on the main islands. That level of isolation has also, somewhat accidentally, turned the island into a conservation success story. The endangered Hawaiian monk seal has found a refuge there. Native plant species documented by Keith Robinson, who is a noted conservationist, survive on Niihau that have disappeared elsewhere. The island even holds critical habitat designation for Brighemia insignis, an endangered Hawaiian plant. The most dramatic footnote in Niihau's history came on December 7, 1941. Hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese Zero pilot named Shigenori Nishikaichi crash-landed on the island after being hit during the raid. He was initially treated with hospitality by the Niihauans, who had no idea what had just happened at Pearl Harbor. The island had no radio contact with the outside world. When word eventually got out about the attack, a struggle ensued that lasted several days and ended with the pilot being killed by one of the island's residents. The episode is now known as the Niihau Incident, and it remains one of the strangest chapters of World War II. Place 8. Kaho'olawe, the island the military left behind. If Niihau is off limits because someone chose to protect it, Kaho'olawe is off limits because someone systematically destroyed it. The smallest of the 8 main Hawaiian islands, Kaho'olawe sits just 7 miles off the coast of Maui. It was settled as early as 400 AD, used for fishing, agriculture, and as a site for navigational training by ancient Hawaiian voyagers. And then the modern world moved in. From the 1850s onward, The island was overgrazed by sheep and cattle, stripping it of much of its vegetation. Then, in the wake of the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy seized Kaho'olawe and turned it into a live bombing and weapons testing range. For decades, the military used the island for target practice. The bombing was so heavy at times that windows on Maui, 7 miles away, would shake. It took decades of protests from native Hawaiians who consider the island sacred before the bombing finally stopped in 1990. The military formally transferred control of Kaho'olawe to the state of Hawaii in 1994. But here's the thing. They didn't exactly hand it back in great shape. The island is still littered with unexploded ordnance. Cleanup efforts have cleared portions of the land, but the job is far from finished, and likely never will be entirely. Today, Kaho'olawe is managed by the Kaho'olawe Island Reserve Commission, known as the KIRC. It is legally off-limits to the general public. The only way to set foot on it is through organized volunteer work trips that KIRC runs, where participants help with ecological restoration, planting native species, removing invasive weeds, and slowly trying to bring back what was destroyed. There's a waiting list. You pay a $100 fee for transportation and boarding. There are no resorts, no tours, no casual visits. For most people, seeing Kaho'olawe means looking at it from the Kehe and Wailea coast of Maui, where it sits on the horizon, visible but untouchable. KIRC Executive Director Mike Nahupi has put it plainly. It's not the Hilton Hawaiian Village. For many native Hawaiians, Kaho'olawe is not just a damaged piece of land. It's considered a sacred embodiment of the god Kanaloa in Hawaiian cosmology, and a site that ancient voyagers used as a reference point for celestial navigation across the Pacific. The Protect Kaho'olawe, Ohana, a grassroots organization formed in the 1970s, led the campaign that eventually forced the Navy to stop. Their effort was not just about ecology, it was about survival of cultural memory. The island is slowly being reclaimed, but at the pace things are going, it will be a very long time before anyone beyond volunteers and cultural practitioners can walk its land freely. Place 7. Kalaupapa Peninsula, Molokai's closed settlement. On the northern shore of Molokai, at the base of some of the tallest sea cliffs in the world, cliffs that rise over 3,000 feet straight out of the ocean, sits the Kalaupapa Peninsula. It is one of the most remote and most restricted places in the entire state. For over 100 years, Kalaupapa served as a forced isolation colony for people diagnosed with leprosy, now known as Hansen's disease. In 1865, the Kingdom of Hawaii enacted a law requiring the quarantine of all leprosy patients. The first 12 people were sent to Kalaupapa in January 1866. They arrived by boat, and the ship never docked. They were forced to swim ashore. Over the following century, more than 8,500 people were exiled to Kalaupapa. They were legally declared dead. They were separated from their families, often permanently. Children were taken. People who contracted the disease were arrested, examined, and shipped off. Many were healthy enough to live ordinary lives, had they been permitted to. The most famous person to dedicate his life to the settlement was Father Damien, a Belgian Catholic priest who arrived in 1873. He lived among the patients, built shelters, organized medical care, and eventually contracted leprosy himself. He died at Kalaupapa in 1889 and was canonized as a saint by Pope Benedict XVI in 2009. Hawaii's isolation law wasn't repealed until 1969. After that, the remaining patients were free to leave. Most of them stayed. As of recent years, only a handful of former patients remain at Kalaupapa, all elderly, ranging in age from their 80s to over 100. The settlement is their home. It has been for most of their lives. Kalaupapa preserves the stories of those who lived in isolation after being diagnosed with Hansen's disease, said Nancy Holman, Superintendent of Kalaupapa National Historical Park. the settlement remains home to a small number of cured patient residents whose privacy is protected by restricting visitation to guided tours only. Access to the peninsula is severely restricted. There are no roads connecting it to the rest of Molokai. The only land route is a 3.5-mile trail with 26 switchbacks descending 2,000 feet down the Pali, the sea cliffs. The trail requires a permit, and permits are only available through a licensed tour operator. There is currently no active concessionaire offering public tours, following closures that began in 2018 and were compounded by the pandemic. Visitors can only enter if sponsored by a resident or employee. Under the law, when the last patient passes away, management of the area will be re-evaluated. Until then, Kalaupapa remains almost entirely closed. Place 6. Sacred Falls State Park, Kaho'olawe, Oahu. On the northeastern shore of Oahu, past Kaneohe, along the Kamehameha Highway, there is a trail that has been gated, fenced, signed, patrolled, and prosecuted for over 2 decades. And people still sneak in. Sacred Falls, known in Hawaiian as Kaho'olawe, is a waterfall tucked at the end of a narrow, steep-sided valley in the district of Hau'ula. Before 1999, it was a popular hike. The trail wound through a gorge of dramatic cliff faces, fruit trees, and rushing water before arriving at an 80-foot waterfall and a pool at its base. According to Hawaiian tradition, the valley is associated with the demigod Kamapua'a, and it was considered a wahi pana, a storied and sacred place. On Mother's Day, 1999, hikers were gathered at the base of the falls when a rock slide struck. 8 people were killed, scores were injured. The state closed Sacred Falls State Park immediately afterward, and it has never reopened. A lawsuit filed by survivors found the state of Hawaii at fault, resulting in a settlement of nearly $9 million. The geology of the site hasn't changed. The Kaho'olawe mountain range that forms the valley walls is composed of fractured basalt, subject to erosion, flash flooding, and unpredictable rockfall. There is, as one enforcement officer put it, simply no way to predict when rocks and boulders will fall. And yet, the trail continues to lure people in. Bloggers post instructions, social media spreads photos, people go around the fence. In 2021, 9 people were sighted inside the park. In 2022, state officials removed an illegally installed rope swing and issued renewed warnings. As of 2025, enforcement patrols have intensified, and the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources has made clear that citations and fines are being handed out actively. The park is not going to reopen. The falls are still there, still beautiful by every account, and still unreachable by anyone who respects the law. What makes Sacred Falls particularly frustrating for officials is how thoroughly the internet has undermined the closure. The DLNR has repeatedly put out statements, released videos, and stepped up enforcement. And in the same week, a travel blogger posts step-by-step instructions. A TikTok goes up. The cycle starts again. In July 2025, the state announced yet another round of increased patrols and enforcement measures, making clear that the closure is not softening with age. There's also an element of this story that tends to get lost in the enforcement headlines. The falls themselves, Kaho'olawe, are not just a pretty waterfall. The valley has deep roots in Hawaiian oral tradition. Stories involving the demigod Kamapua'a place the valley at the center of one of the most well-known legends in Kaho'olawe. It was a place people went with intention and respect, not a thrill hike. The way it's being treated now, as a fence to get around, is a kind of irony that the people who managed it before the modern era might have found difficult to comprehend. Place 5. Haiku Stairs, Oahu's Stairway to Heaven. This one has a particularly unusual ending, or rather, it's still being written. The Haiku Stairs, better known as the Stairway to Heaven, are a series of 3,922 steep metal steps that climb the ridgeline of the Kaho'olawe Range in eastern Oahu, rising to 2,800 feet above sea level. They were built in 1942 by the U.S. Navy to provide access to a top-secret radio transmission station used to communicate with submarines across the Pacific during World War II. The U.S. Coast Guard later took over the facility and allowed public access briefly in the 1970s. After a television appearance boosted visitation, access was shut down in 1987, and the stairs have been officially closed ever since. But officially closed turned out to mean very little once social media got involved. The views from the top are extraordinary, and images of hikers ascending through clouds on an impossibly steep stairway became viral content. Thousands of people trespassed annually, slipping through a residential neighborhood in the pre-dawn hours to avoid the security guards hired to keep them out. Hawaii spent approximately $250,000 per year on those guards. In 2021, the Honolulu City Council voted unanimously to remove the stairs. In April 2024, demolition was announced, contracts were signed, and a blessing was held in the valley. Then, the Friends of Haiku Stairs filed a lawsuit. An appeals court granted an injunction. Partial removal began before the injunction halted the work. As of mid-2025, a new lawsuit has been filed, challenging the state's Historic Preservation Division for reversing its earlier position that the stairs were worth saving. The stairs are fenced, monitored, and the subject of active litigation. Access remains illegal. Citations carry fines up to $2,000. Hikers have been arrested. And the stairs, or what's left of them, are still drawing people who want one last look before they're gone entirely. The social media angle here is probably the most relevant chapter in what happened to the Haiku Stairs. The structure was closed for years before Instagram existed. The moment aerial drone footage started circulating online, hikers climbing through low clouds on a metal stairway that seemed to disappear into the sky, it became a bucket list item for people who had no idea it was illegal and for a significant number who knew perfectly well. The city's security guards, stationed at the residential neighborhood entry point, were turning away thousands of people every year. Hikers simply found other routes through the jungle, often more dangerous ones, to reach the top from the backside of the mountain. The Friends of Haiku Stairs argue that the city created a self-defeating situation. By refusing to allow managed access, they pushed people onto unauthorized trails that caused far more erosion and resulted in more helicopter rescues than the stairs themselves ever did. It's a reasonable point. Whether the courts agree or whether the stairs survive long enough for a court to rule definitively is still being decided. What was once a Navy utility structure has become one of the most publicly contested landmarks in Honolulu. That's a strange fate for a staircase that most people never even knew existed until social media made it famous. Place 4. Waipio Valley, the Valley of the Kings. Waipio Valley on the Big Island is not some obscure corner of the map. It's well known, photographed constantly from the overlook, and famous as the place where Kamehameha the Great trained before unifying the Hawaiian Islands in the late 18th century. The valley was once the political and spiritual center of ancient Hawaii, home to ruling chiefs, alii, including King Liloa in the 15th century. It was densely populated, full of taro fields fed by elaborate irrigation systems, and dotted with sacred heiau. Today, the valley floor is largely wilderness, inhabited by a small number of families who farm taro and crossed by wild horses. And since 2022, access has been formally closed to independent visitors. The closure stems from a geotechnical assessment that identified serious rockfall and landslide risks along Waipio Valley Road, one of the steepest paved roads in the United States with a 25% grade. The report found an immediate need to address slope instability and erosion. Hawaii County issued an emergency rule that has been renewed multiple times since then, most recently in late 2025. Under the current rules, walking, horseback riding, and ATVs are prohibited on the Valley Road entirely. Independent vehicle access is restricted to Hawaii Island residents, permitted tour operators, and Native Hawaiians exercising traditional and customary rights. For everyone else, the only legal way into the valley is with an authorized tour company. The Waipio Valley Shuttle, operated by families who live and farm in the valley, is the primary option for visitors. The overlook at the top of the road remains open and free, offering views of the black sand beach, the winding river, and Kaho'olawe Falls, one of the tallest waterfalls in the state at over 1,000 feet. You can see the valley. Getting into it on your own terms is no longer something the county permits. The casual, independent access that once existed for generations is gone. Guided tours still operate through local families who live and farm in the valley, and they remain the only legal option for visitors who aren't island residents. The closure has been in effect since 2022 and renewed multiple times with no clear end date. Whether it's primarily about safety or resource management depends on who you ask, but the answer the county keeps giving is the same either way. Place 3. Kipahulu Valley Biological Reserve, Haleakala's hidden half. Most people who visit Haleakala National Park on Maui spend their time at the Summit Crater or at the Kipahulu Coastal District near Hana, where the 7 sacred pools sit and the Piwai Trail winds through a bamboo forest. That part of the park is open to the public, even if swimming in the pools has been prohibited due to flash flood and rockfall hazards. But the section between the summit and the coast, the Kipahulu Valley itself, stretching from the crater rim down to around 300 feet above sea level, is a different story entirely. The Kipahulu Valley Biological Reserve covers approximately 4,000 acres of some of the most intact rainforest in the Hawaiian Islands. It was designated a reserve specifically because of how extraordinarily rare and fragile it is. The forest here is home to native Hawaiian species found nowhere else, birds, plants, and invertebrates that have survived precisely because humans haven't gotten to them yet. Access is off limits to the general public. The National Park Service controls entry strictly, limiting it to researchers conducting specific scientific studies, with permits required and visits tightly supervised. No trails pass through the reserve. No casual hiking is permitted. The reasoning is straightforward. Introduced species, including the seeds carried on hikers' boots and clothing, represent a genuine threat to an ecosystem that took millions of years to develop. The reserve exists because keeping people out has worked. Within Haleakala, more broadly, specific heiau sites and burial grounds are protected and restricted separately, with access denied to the public to safeguard their cultural integrity for native Hawaiians. The Kipahulu Valley Reserve is also a case study in what a relatively successful conservation effort actually looks like in practice. Hawaii has lost more species, both plant and animal, to extinction than any other state in the nation. The islands evolved in isolation for millions of years, producing life found nowhere else on Earth. And then human arrival, in waves from ancient Polynesian settlement through Western contact, through the explosion of tourism, brought invasive species, habitat destruction, and ecosystem collapse on a scale that's hard to overstate. The Kipahulu Valley's intact state is the exception, not the rule. Native Hawaiian birds survive in the upper forest of the reserve that have been functionally wiped out elsewhere on the island due to avian malaria spread by mosquitoes introduced by humans. The higher elevation of the valley provides a cold enough environment to slow mosquito breeding, giving native bird populations a refuge. Researchers who have been granted access describe conditions in the reserve as a window into what the Hawaiian Islands looked like before contact. Dense native forest, thriving endemic species, a biological world largely intact. Keeping it that way requires keeping most people out. That's not a romantic or particularly satisfying answer for anyone who'd like to walk through it, but given what Hawaii has already lost, it's hard to argue with the logic. Place 2. Honopu Beach, Kauai's Valley of the Lost. On Kauai's remote Napali coast, accessible only by boat or on foot along the grueling 11-mile Kalaupapa Trail, lies a series of valleys that already feel like they belong to another world. And then there's Honopu. Honopu Valley, separated from neighboring Kalaupapa Beach by a rock arch and a stretch of open ocean, is only legally accessible by swimming from an anchored boat or from Kalaupapa Beach itself. You cannot hike in. There is no trail. The swim between Kalaupapa and Honopu requires crossing open water in conditions that are frequently dangerous: strong currents, surge, and unpredictable swells. Many visitors who attempt it are simply not strong enough swimmers for the conditions, and rescue operations in this area are not rare. Landing at Honopu requires State of Hawaii permits. The beach itself sits within the Napali Coast State Wilderness Park, which has its own strict permit system governing camping and access along the entire coastline. Day hiking on the Kalaupapa Trail beyond Hanakapiai Beach requires a permit. Camping at Kalaupapa requires a separate camping permit, both of which sell out far in advance. The beach at Honopu, flanked by towering green cliffs that rise hundreds of feet on either side, is considered one of the most beautiful and isolated spots in the entire Pacific. It appeared briefly in the 1976 film King Kong and has since captured a mythological quality in the imagination of people who see photos of it. The difficulty and legal requirements of reaching it mean that on most days, no one is there at all. That's not entirely by accident. The Napali Coast was designated a wilderness park, specifically to preserve its undeveloped character, and the permit systems and physical barriers do a reasonable job of keeping it that way. Place 1. Lehua Island, Niihau's off-limits neighbor. Just off the northern tip of Niihau sits Lehua, a small, crescent-shaped island formed from the remnant of an extinct volcanic crater. It's uninhabited, visually striking, and almost completely off-limits. Lehua is a state seabird sanctuary. The Hawaii Division of Forestry and Wildlife controls access, and landing on the island is restricted to protect nesting seabirds and the ecosystem that depends on them. The birds that nest here include Newell's shearwaters, red-footed boobies, and wedge-tailed shearwaters, species that are ground nesting and extraordinarily vulnerable to disturbance, predators, and human intrusion. In recent years, there has been an active effort by conservation organizations to eradicate invasive rats from Lehua, which prey on the eggs and chicks of nesting birds. The project has made significant progress, and the island is considered one of the more successful examples of island restoration in Hawaii, but it requires keeping most people out. Boat tours from Kauai do travel to the waters off Lehua, offering snorkeling and diving in an area known for exceptional underwater visibility, up to 150 feet in clear conditions. But landing on the island itself is restricted. You can float in its waters, watch birds from the deck of a boat, and look at its dramatic cliffs. Actually, setting foot on Lehua without proper authorization is not permitted. Like Niihau beside it, Lehua remains one of those places in Hawaii that most people will only ever see from a distance. Close enough to be real, far enough away to stay a mystery. The rat eradication effort on Lehua deserves more attention than it typically gets. In 2017, a project coordinated by the Island Conservation Group, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and several other organizations dropped rodenticide bait across the island by helicopter in an effort to eliminate the invasive Polynesian and black rats that had been devastating seabird populations for decades. The project was controversial among some who worried about effects on native species, particularly the monk seals and Hawaiian spinner dolphins that frequent the waters around Lehua. But it was also considered a scientific necessity. Early monitoring after the operation showed significant increases in seabird nesting success. Projects like the one at Lehua represent one of the core tensions in Hawaiian conservation. Doing meaningful restoration often requires drastic intervention, and both the intervention and the restricted access that follows it are genuinely necessary if the goal is to preserve species that exist nowhere else. You can't let people freely wander through a seabird nesting colony while trying to rebuild it from decades of predation damage. The waters around Lehua, meanwhile, are widely regarded as some of the best diving and snorkeling in the entire Hawaiian island chain. The restricted access to the island itself has, somewhat paradoxically, helped keep the underwater environment around it in excellent condition too. Hawaii is big enough that millions of people visit every year and come away feeling like they've seen everything worth seeing. But these 9 places make a reasonable case that the most interesting parts of any destination are often the ones you can't simply book a ticket to. A forbidden island that hasn't changed in a century. A valley of kings that's closing its doors. A staircase in the middle of a legal battle that nobody expected. A leprosy settlement where the last survivors chose to stay. Some places are restricted because they're dangerous. Some because they're sacred. Some because the damage is still being counted. And a few because someone made a promise a very long time ago and actually kept it. If you found this worth your time, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more of Hawaii's hidden history where this came from.